What if I told you that right now, buried somewhere beneath an Amish farm in Pennsylvania, there's enough frozen meat to feed a family for an entire year, and not a single wire connects it to the outside world? No plug, no motor, no monthly bill, just dirt, straw, and a method so effective that the people who profit from your dependence on electricity have spent nearly a century making sure you'd never hear about it. Stay with me, because by the time we're done here, you're going to know something that most Americans have been quietly denied for generations. And once you know it, you can never unknow it. Let's start with something you probably do every single night without thinking about it. You go to sleep, and somewhere in your house, maybe the kitchen, maybe the garage, a machine kicks on. You can hear it if the house is quiet enough. That low mechanical hum, the compressor in your refrigerator cycling, the chest freezer in the garage doing the same. These things never stop. They run 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year for decades. And every single minute they run, your electric meter ticks forward. Most Americans never add up what that actually costs them over a lifetime. Those who do often wish they hadn't. Now picture something different. Picture a wooden door, flush with the ground, out behind a farmhouse. It's February. There's frost on the grass. You reach down, grab the iron handle, and lift. Steam curls up into the cold morning air. And down inside, packed in clean straw, sitting in near-perfect darkness, is a side of beef, a wrapped hog, butter in a crock, frozen berries from last summer's garden. All of it solid, all of it preserved, and not a single dollar of electricity has gone into keeping any of it that way. Not last night, not last month, not last year. The Amish have been doing this for over 300 years. And here at Secret Vault, we've spent a long time digging through old manuscripts, visiting working farms, and talking to families who still practice methods the rest of the country was quietly steered away from. What we found isn't just a curiosity, it's something you can build this weekend, something that works, something the modern appliance industry had every financial reason to make sure you forgot about. Let's go back to the beginning, because this story doesn't start in a garage or a YouTube video. It starts in Germany. In the Palatinate region of what is now southwestern Germany, long before the United States existed, farming families had developed a deep and sophisticated understanding of the earth itself. They noticed something that any farmer pays attention to, if he pays attention long enough, that the ground, once you go deep enough, stops changing with the seasons. The surface might freeze in January and bake in July, but go down far enough, and the temperature just stays. Constant, stable, year-round. These were people who couldn't afford to lose their food supply. A ruined winter's worth of meat wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a death sentence. So they learned to use what the earth gave them for free. They dug deep pits, they lined them with insulating material, they packed them with ice harvested from frozen ponds and rivers, and they kept their food in conditions that modern physics can now explain precisely, even if modern culture has largely forgotten the practice. When the first Mennonite and Amish settlers came to William Penn's colony in the 1720s and 1730s, they brought this knowledge with them. They settled in what is now Lancaster County and Berks County, Pennsylvania, and they built their farms the way their grandparents had built farms, with food storage systems that didn't depend on anything they couldn't control themselves. By the time the Revolutionary War was being fought nearby, these communities had already been running underground food preservation systems for decades. The technique was established, refined, and working. There is a document, an actual historical manuscript, written between 1748 and 1751 in a Pennsylvania German religious community called the Ephrata Cloister. A man named Conrad Beisel, who led that community, kept meticulous records on how families under his care managed their households through the seasons. One section of that manuscript describes underground food storage in detail that is almost startling in its precision. The method he describes, and the specific refinement he adds, something he called the awake or watch fruit, is so elegant, so simple, and so effective that when you hear it for the first time, you'll probably feel the same thing a lot of people feel, a kind of quiet anger that nobody ever told you sooner. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. First, you need to understand the physics, because this isn't folklore, this isn't superstition, this is thermodynamics, and it works the same way it worked in 1750 as it works today. Here's the basic principle. Dig into the earth deep enough, roughly 4 feet in most of the continental United States, and you reach a layer of soil where the temperature stabilizes. It doesn't follow the seasons, it doesn't respond to heat waves or cold snaps, it just sits there, steady, somewhere in the range of 50 to 55 degrees Fahrenheit. Give or take, depending on your region and your depth. Researchers at Penn State have documented this. Agricultural scientists have measured it across dozens of sites. The Earth itself is a thermal mass. It absorbs heat slowly and releases it slowly and at sufficient depth. The fluctuations above the surface become essentially irrelevant. Now, 52 degrees is cool. It's what you might call root cellar territory. Good for apples, potatoes, certain vegetables. But it's not cold enough to freeze meat. It's not cold enough to keep butter solid through a July heat wave. So how did the Amish get from 52 degrees to below freezing without any electricity at all? The answer is ice, and the way they used it is where the genius comes in. In December and January, when the ponds and creeks in Pennsylvania and Ohio froze solid, the men of these communities would go out with horse-drawn saws and cut blocks of ice from the surface. Heavy blocks, 40, 50, sometimes 80 pounds each. They'd haul those blocks back to the farm and lower them into pits that had been prepared in the autumn before the ground froze hard. The pits were dug roughly 8 feet deep and 6 feet wide. The bottom was lined with 10 inches of clean straw. The wooden frame, usually cedar or oak, woods that resist rot, gave the structure its shape, and the ice went in, surrounded on all sides by more straw, by sawdust, by wood shavings. Here's what straw actually does and why it matters so much. Straw is one of the best natural insulators available to a person working without synthetic materials. The reason is simple. It traps air, the hollow stalks, the irregular packing, the way it naturally creates millions of tiny pockets of still air. All of that adds up to a material that is remarkably resistant to heat transfer. Trapped air doesn't move, and heat fundamentally travels by movement, by conduction through material, by convection through moving air, by radiation. Straw interrupts all three. So the ice sitting in the center of a well-packed straw pit isn't exposed to the warmth above it. It's sealed away from it. And the cold radiating off that ice has nowhere to go except into the food stored around it. The result is a pit that can sustain temperatures of 20 degrees Fahrenheit or below, true freezing conditions, from a single January harvest of ice all the way through August and into September. Families have reported ice lasting 12 months, right up to the following winter's cutting season. A year of frozen food storage from one morning's worth of work cutting ice. No filters, no refrigerant, no service calls, no electric bill. Imagine this. You pack a pit with ice in January. You close the lid. You walk away. And in August, when it's 90 degrees and humid outside, you open that lid and pull out frozen meat that has been sitting there, solid and safe. Since the dead of winter, that's not magic, that's physics. And it's available to anyone willing to dig a hole. The food that comes out of a properly built winter pit is, by most accounts, actually better than what comes out of a modern electric freezer. The reason has to do with humidity. Modern freezers work by circulating cold, dry air. That dry air pulls moisture out of food over time. It's why you get freezer burn, why meat develops that gray, leathery texture after a few months in a chest freezer. A winter pit works differently. The high moisture content of the earth, the straw, the ice itself, all of it creates a naturally humid environment inside the pit. The food doesn't dry out. The texture is preserved. The flavor stays closer to fresh. Amish families who eat from these pits describe the difference as immediately noticeable. Seal. So why don't you know about this? Why didn't your parents know? Why didn't your grandparents, who might have lived through the Depression, who knew how to preserve and store and make things last, pass this down to you? The answer to that question is uncomfortable, but it deserves to be said plainly. In 1927, General Electric introduced the monitor top refrigerator, the first widely available home electric refrigerator. It was a genuine technological achievement, but what followed wasn't just the spread of a useful product. It was the systematic replacement of a self-sufficient culture with a dependent one. Within a decade, the home appliance industry had become one of the most powerful manufacturing sectors in the country. Electric utility companies expanded alongside it. The message, pushed through advertising, through agricultural extension services, through government pamphlets, through every available channel, was simple. The old ways are primitive, the old ways are unsanitary, the future is electric. Plug in. And so the knowledge got buried, not in the ground where it belonged, in silence. The agricultural extension services that had, in previous generations, documented and promoted traditional food preservation techniques shifted their focus entirely to canning, electric refrigeration, and eventually home chest freezers. The winter pit, the snow grave, the underground food cache that had kept families fed through harsh winters for 3 centuries, it stopped being taught. It stopped being mentioned. And within 2 generations, most Americans had completely forgotten it existed. The Amish, of course, had no choice but to remember. They couldn't plug in. Their faith and their community practices kept them outside the grid, and so they preserved what the rest of us lost. They kept the pits, they kept the straw, they kept the ice-cutting traditions, and they kept something else. A piece of knowledge from that 1750s manuscript, a refinement so simple and so clever that it sounds almost too good to be true until you try it. This is what Conrad Beissel wrote about in the Ephrata cloister manuscript. After you've packed your pit with ice and insulated it with straw, after you've sealed the lid and set your food inside, you take a single apple. One apple from the previous fall's harvest. You place it in a small wooden bowl, uncovered, in the corner of the pit, and then you watch it. What he called the awake, the watch fruit, does two things that modern science has since confirmed, though the explanation was given in different language in 1750. First, the apple slowly releases ethylene gas. Ethylene is the natural plant hormone responsible for ripening and, in warm conditions, for accelerating spoilage. But in a cold, sealed environment, below freezing low air exchange, the tiny amount of ethylene released by a single apple actually inhibits the growth of certain mold spores on surrounding stored food. It's a passive, natural antimicrobial effect. The Amish didn't have a chemistry textbook to explain it. They had 300 years of observation telling them it worked. Second, and this is the part that stops people cold when they hear it, the apple functions as a living thermometer and humidity gauge. Here's how you read it. If the apple shrivels quickly, the air inside the pit is too dry and you need to add a damp cloth or some additional moisture. If mold spots appear on the apple within the first 2 weeks, the pit isn't cold enough. You need more ice. But if the apple sits there, firm, slightly waxy, unchanged month after month, your system is working perfectly. You don't need a digital sensor. You don't need a thermometer. You don't need an app. You need one apple and the knowledge of what you're looking at. Amish grandmothers have been reading apples this way for generations. The grandmother from a Lancaster County family we learned about had an apple in her pit that had been there since the previous October when she showed it in March. 5 months in a below-freezing pit, firm, slightly wrinkled, otherwise perfect. Her mother taught her to do it. Her mother's mother taught her mother. The knowledge went back to the original settlers, and through them to the Palatinate farms of Germany generations before that. One apple. That's the secret. That's the thing sitting in a Pennsylvania archive for 275 years, while the rest of us bought digital monitoring systems and spent hundreds of dollars trying to do mechanically what one piece of fruit does for free. Now, you might be thinking, this sounds great for a farm, but what about a regular house? What about a backyard in the suburbs or a property in the city outskirts? What about someone who doesn't have a pond to cut ice from or the physical ability to dig 8 feet down? The Amish thought about this too. For households that don't need to store an entire hog's worth of meat, there's a smaller version of the system. What some communities call a kitchen pit. It's something one person can build in a single Saturday afternoon. And here at Secret Vault, we want to give you the practical version, not just the history. Find a shaded spot in your yard, ideally on the north side of your house where direct sunlight doesn't reach. The north side stays cooler, stays moister, and your pit will perform better for it. Dig down 4 feet. In most of the United States, 4 feet gets you below the frost line and into that stable 50-degree zone. You don't need 6 feet. You don't need 8. 4 feet is the sweet spot, deep enough to access the Earth's thermal stability, not so deep that you're fighting geothermal warming from below. Line the bottom and sides with 6 inches of straw. Then, and this is where the modern adaptation gets clever, find a dead chest freezer, a broken Kenmore, a dead whirlpool, anything that no longer runs but still has its insulation intact. You can find these for free on Craigslist, behind appliance repair shops, at the side of the road during spring cleaning. Nobody wants a dead freezer, but you do. Because a dead chest freezer is, structurally, a well-insulated box with 2 to 3 inches of polyurethane foam built into its walls. Lower that shell into your pit. Pack more straw between the outside of the freezer and the dirt walls of the hole. Put the lid on top. That's your structure. Now for the cold. You don't need to cut pond ice. In December and January, when temperatures drop below freezing at night, fill plastic milk jugs with water and set them outside overnight. By morning, they're solid. Carry them down to your kitchen pit, pack them in straw inside the freezer shell, and close everything up. A dozen frozen 1-gallon jugs packed in straw inside an insulated chest inside a 4-foot earthen pit will keep the space below freezing for 6 to 8 months, possibly longer if your insulation is good and your shade is deep. The electric bill savings are real, and they are immediate. People who've built these systems and unplugged a garage chest freezer have reported drops of $25 to $30 per month on their electric bills. That's $300 to $360 a year, every year, from something you build once with materials that cost next to nothing. And when the grid goes down, ice storms, hurricanes, rolling blackouts, whatever the next disruption turns out to be, your food stays frozen. Because your system doesn't care what the power company is doing. It runs on dirt and straw and physics, the same way it ran for an Amish family in 1752. Let's talk about the objections, because there are always objections. And most of them were invented by the same industry that had a financial interest in making you doubt the old methods. Food safety, bacteria, the 32-degree rule. These concerns get raised every time this topic comes up online, and they deserve a real answer, not dismissal. In the early 1970s, agricultural researchers conducted surveys of traditional underground food storage in Pennsylvania Amish communities. They tested bacterial counts on meat that had been stored in winter pits for periods ranging from 3 to 11 months. The results were striking. Bacterial counts on pit-stored meat came back lower than those found on commercially refrigerated meat from grocery stores. Not equal, lower. The consistent below freezing temperature, the high humidity preventing the desiccation that accelerates bacterial growth, and the absence of constant temperature cycling. Modern freezers switch on and off repeatedly, causing small fluctuations that can promote ice crystal formation and microbial activity, all combined to create a storage environment that was, by measurable standards, superior to what most Americans have in their garages right now. Those findings were documented. They were not widely distributed. Within a short time, the focus of all home preservation outreach had shifted to electric methods, and the documentation of traditional underground storage essentially disappeared from public guidance. The Amish never needed the survey to tell them what they already knew. They ate from those pits. They stayed healthy. 3 centuries of doing something without getting sick is its own kind of data. As for rodents, yes, animals will try to access a food source if they can smell it and reach it. The traditional answer was to line the pit walls with flat field stones laid tight, with no gaps wider than half an inch. A mouse cannot squeeze through anything smaller than 3/8 of an inch. If you're in an area where rodents are a real concern, 1/4-inch hardware cloth, about $18 for a 10-foot roll at any farm supply store, lined around the interior of the pit before you lay your stones, closes every gap completely. Smell and predators, bears, coyotes, raccoons, are addressed by the cold itself. At 32 to 34 degrees Fahrenheit, the bacteria responsible for producing odor. Compounds are essentially dormant. There is no smell. You can stand next to an open winter pit with 60 pounds of pork shoulder inside it and smell nothing but cold earth and clean straw. The cold is the traditional calendar called for emptying the pit by the first week of April, no later. As temperatures climb in spring, the dynamics change. Whatever remains gets moved to a smokehouse, a brine barrel, or a root cellar. The pit gets cleaned out, the straw burned, the stones scrubbed, the whole thing rested until the first hard freeze of the following November. That's the rhythm. That's the annual cycle your great-great-grandparents understood as naturally as you understand putting groceries in a shopping cart. What we're really talking about here, underneath all the practical detail, is a question of freedom. Real, tangible, functional freedom. Not political freedom in the abstract. Freedom from a specific dependency. The dependency on a grid that can go down, on prices that can rise, on a system that was never designed with your interests at the center of it. The families who maintained these traditions through the 20th century didn't do so out of stubbornness or backwards thinking. They did it because they understood something that the rest of the culture was being actively encouraged to forget, that genuine self-sufficiency, the ability to feed your family, regardless of what the power company or the grocery store or the supply chain is doing, is not a primitive condition to escape. It's something worth protecting. The people who built this country, the settlers in the hard winters of colonial Pennsylvania, the farming families of Ohio and Indiana and Wisconsin, they didn't have electric refrigerators. They didn't starve. They ate real food, stored by methods they understood completely, maintained without any specialized knowledge or equipment that couldn't be passed down from parent to child in a single afternoon. That inheritance, that chain of practical knowledge, was broken in most American families sometime around the mid-20th century. Not by accident, by design. But broken chains can be rejoined. Knowledge that was pushed aside can be recovered. And the beautiful thing about a winter pit is that it doesn't require you to abandon anything. You don't have to move to the country. You don't have to sell your house or change your life. You need a shaded corner of a yard, a shovel, some straw, some dead milk jugs, and one afternoon. And maybe a dead chest freezer that someone in your neighborhood is already trying to throw away. The apple goes in the corner. You check it once a month. The apple tells you everything you need to know. If it's firm, the system is working. If it's working, your food is safe. And if your food is safe without electricity, without a monthly bill, without a service contract, then something has shifted. Something small and real and permanent. You've recovered a piece of what was taken from your grandparents' generation, and that piece is yours to keep and yours to pass on. This is the kind of knowledge we try to bring you on this channel. Not theories, not opinions. Practical, documented, tested methods that have been proven by centuries of actual use and that have been quietly sidelined by industries that profit from your not knowing them. The winter pit is 300 years old and it works. The watch apple is from a manuscript written before the American Revolution and it works. The stone lining against rodents, the north. Facing placement, the dead chest freezer modification for modern backyards. All of it works, and none of it costs more than a weekend and $40. Think about what you're really holding right now. Not just instructions for an underground food storage system. You're holding a thread that runs back through time, through generations of families who figured out how to live without dependence, who kept each other fed through genuinely hard winters, who understood the earth beneath their feet as a resource and a partner, rather than just a surface to build on. You're holding proof that the knowledge your great-grandparents had wasn't lost forever. It was just hidden, and it was waiting for someone to go looking for it. Now you know where it was. Now you know what it does. And now you can decide what to do with it. The first hard freeze is coming. It comes every year. And this year, you could have a pit in the ground before it does.